Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight at the Asia Society. I'm Jane Perlez, the former bureau chief of the New York Times in Beijing. I now host the podcast Face Off about the ups and downs in the US-China. I'm pleased to be here, and especially pleased to be here with Orville Schell, who, as you know, has covered Chinese leaders and their American counterparts for over the past half-century, an unparalleled record. Don't think anybody's done it so much and so intensely, Orville. He has a unique perspective on the arc of the US-China relationship. It began when he was an exchange student at the National Taiwan University. Then he went to Shanghai. And then we'll talk about what he did after that in a while. But he went to earn a PhD in Chinese history at the University of California, Berkeley, and many years later became a journalism professor. And there are many of his graduates populated throughout American journalism. He's written many books on China, including a wonderful novel, My Old Home, which I'm reading at the moment and which I highly recommend, even if it is a bit heartbreaking, I have to say. He currently serves, as you all know, as the Arthur Ross Director of the Center on US-China Relations here at the Asia Society. So if you don't mind, a round of applause for Orville. Orville, tonight I want to take us on a journey. I want you to take us on a journey through the Chinese leaders and their American counterparts. You first went to mainland China in 1975. Mao was still alive, though you didn't meet him then, or ever. But to use one of your favorite phrases, tonight we'll try to figure out how did we get here where we are right now? Is the deep split between the two countries inevitable? Has it been hastened by the personalities at the top? As you say, you can often tell more from the people at the top and their interactions than from policy papers drawn up in the seclusion of the White House and Zhongnanhai. So let's start with the very first leader of China, Mao. You didn't personally meet him, but you have this wonderful black and white photograph of Orville in the Shanghai Electrical Machinery Factory in 1975. And you're standing in front of what looks like a very intense industrial machine, and your Chinese colleague seems to be doing most of the work, if I may say. You're wearing a Mao-like hat, and you're looking quite pleased. The Cultural Revolution was coming to an end. You were there in a delegation sponsored by Zhou Enlai. What was that trip like, and what are the most salient memories from that trip and that experience?
Well, it's great to be here with you, Jane, and Face Off is a wonderful podcast you all ought to tune into. So it's a pleasure to be part of it. You know, apropos of Chairman Mao, and when I went to China, I went as on what was called a 青年劳动团, a youth labor brigade to sort of join the people and work to build a better China. And one of the factories that I worked at was a factory that Mao had visited. And because Mao had visited it, it was in the 1950s, at that time it had this huge auditorium that had a straw roof. And because he visited it, they never would change the roof. And they couldn't get straw. Nobody knew how to build that kind of roof anymore, but they would be damned if they were going to change it one whit.
Did it leak?
So not that I remember, but it was a kind of a bespoke of the genuflective quality that everybody was in towards Chairman Mao, that if he touched something, anointed something with his presence, it was et aeternam, not to be destroyed. So that was a very strange trip for me. It was the end of the Cultural Revolution, and at the time there was this movement to criticize Lin Biao, who plane had just crashed in Mongolia, and he died. And strangely, Confucius. So who was Confucius? Well, Confucius was Zhou Enlai. And so I used to sit in these head-bangingly boring meetings where we'd have to read some document and then there's another expression in Chinese, 表态, where you have to state your position. Everybody has to do it. So that we'd sit in these meetings, you'd have to read this document and say why you agreed with it and why you thought Confucius was a bad person and go on with the program. So that, for me, was an incredibly important experience because it anchored me in the period of Mao. I didn't meet Mao, but everywhere around us was Mao, 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 Mao. So you lived in that ethos.
But could you tell how much the people that you were interacting with, the workers, this guy at the machine, for example, and others, how much did they believe in this stuff by this stage?
You know, it wasn't even a question, did they believe and in their hearts have some subversive thoughts? I think yes. But the presence of Mao and the sort of suffocating effect of his orthodoxy was so powerful that you never could get there, particularly with a foreigner. So just to give you an idea of, I mean, we were there for several months, but I felt completely isolated.
Were you the only foreigner?
No. I think there were like eight people, or I forget how many. There were only one or two of us who spoke any Chinese. But the idea of being able to actually interact with anybody was impossible. So I remember vividly there was this lovely young woman at the factory, and of course, I noticed her. And
what did you do about it?
Well, there wasn't a hell of a lot I could do except notice. But one night, we went to this auditorium with the grass roof that was there as a memorial to Chairman Mao, and we were watching a film on an alarm clock factory, stunningly exciting film. And I came in a little late, and I was ushered into a room in the dark, and this young woman, my good Lord, this happened. And ask her a few little questions about her, and then the next thing, strong young Chinese factory physically moved me over seats, because at that point there was no possibility of any kind of real interaction, much less with a woman, but even with anyone. It was all very scripted and very programmed.
How long were you there for that trip?
I was there for 2.5 months.
Did your Chinese improve?
It did, but I came out. I was writing for the New Yorker at the time. And when I came out to try to write the thing up for them, I mean, I felt very confused by it because I'd spent 2 years in Taiwan. I thought I kind of understood fundamentally how to get along with people in Chinese culture, but I got to China and the window was closed. Wherever, no matter what you did, you were foreign and you were outside. You weren't going to be let inside, and if you got up early in the morning and started wandering around, they would come and get you. And when I worked at this model, very famous work brigade, the Dajai model agricultural brigade in Shanxi province.
What did you do? Hoe the fields?
Oh, we spread manure, hoed fields, one thing and another. But one afternoon, just to give you another example of the insolubility of foreigners in China at that time, even though we were being sponsored by the Friendship Association, after work I decided, well, what the heck, I'll take a walk. And so I went over to the next village. I'd hardly gotten to the next village that a car came and picked me up and scolded me and said, this isn't in the program. Took me back. So I only say that by way of noting that during that period, the separation between us and them, the inside, the outside, again in Chinese there's expressions for that, was pretty extreme, which is interesting because it ultimately did change, and we'll get to that.
Well, let's fast forward to Deng Xiaoping, who changed everything because he came to the United States in 1979 to normalize relations. and you were there in Texas at the rodeo. You wrote you had a sagging paper plate of barbecue and baked beans as this rodeo was going on. Tell us about what happened with Deng Xiaoping, what was so remarkable about it, and why was Texas on the itinerary for that big visit?
I think that, what I've just said about the atmosphere in China was transformed by this visit when Deng Xiaoping came in 1979. Of course, he came to power, back to power, after being cashiered twice in 1978, and then began this extraordinary period of reforms. And for those who were in China, sort of in between the period when he came back to power and came to Washington and then to Texas, things like Democracy Wall happened, which were stunning moments where all of a sudden a wall around a very unprepossessing bus lot on Xidan started sprouting up posters, and people started gathering and giving speeches. And Deng Xiaoping said, it's okay to let the people speak. And why did he say that? Because he was struggling against conservative forces, and Hua Guofeng, who was then the chairman of the party, hadn't yet been defenestrated. But you could sense this new openness, and I remember being in China just feeling, this is, where did this come from? So Deng Xiaoping shows up when Carter finally was able to work out how to normalize diplomatic relations. And all of a sudden, all of America, which had been in this deep freeze, cold locker of Cold War for decades, were dressing in Mao suits. Bloomingdale's was selling Mao suits, and they were all piling down to the National Gallery of the Arts to have the reception with Deng Xiaoping, and suddenly China was in vogue again. And what was so interesting about that moment and Deng Xiaoping was he was a very practical guy. And I think he had decided that he'd had very great trouble in the Cultural Revolution, that he had to radically change the whole model, and that we had to actually begin to interact. So he came to America, and it was the first time that the Chinese had ever seen satellite television from America, and the whole trip was covered.
You mean beam back to China?
Yeah, beam back to China.
Live?
Live. And NBC was helping the Chinese set up the satellites, teaching them how to do it. But you had this sudden sense of immense release where it was, everybody had permission to be friends and interact. So we got down to Texas. And
why was Texas on the itinerary?
Well, the Johnson Space Center was down there. So we went from Washington, where that was quite an amazing scene at the White House and around Washington, then down to Atlanta, Georgia, where Jimmy Carter, who was the presiding president here, came from. And then we went to Texas. And after the Johnson Space Center, we went out to a small town about an hour outside of Houston, where there was an enclosed rodeo arena. And when we got there, it was raining and it was night, and we went inside, and there were all of the comrades, and Deng Xiaoping and Fang Yi, the Vice Minister of Science and Technology, and all these other well-known Chinese officials sitting there with these groaning paper plates of, ribs and beans and the whole 9 yards, the Texas barbecue. And then again, the messaging was quite sublime, and I think this is why I think that the quality of leaders and their personalities sometimes has more to do with what happens than all the policy discussions and documents. And what I mean to say by that is there was Deng Xiaoping. We had a little barbecue, and we all went out and sat in
When you say we all, you mean the White House press corps? I mean hundreds of reporters?
No, there weren't that many. I mean, things in those days were kind of a smaller scale. It was probably us of us, maybe 25 or 30. I mean, not everybody went on the whole trip. I did, and I went to Disneyland with Fang Yi, this other vice minister. That was fun. But so there we are, sitting at this rodeo arena, and you may have seen this on video. The two lovely young Texas cowgirls came out, comrades. And of course, it came right down over his eyes, but never mind. But that moment was all on television, all across America and all across China. And there was, I don't know who was singing, Merle Haggard, some country western songs, and it was a signal. It's okay. We can start to get together.
I've sometimes wondered, did someone sort of program the writer to put the hat on his head, or did she do it spontaneously?
No. This is all. I'm sure that the Chinese agreed, because there is no greater symbol than a 10-gallon hat from Texas of America. And for Deng Xiaoping to consent to have that put on his head, he was basically being anointed with the crown of Americana, saying, Chinese people, I'm here. These are basically not our enemy now. So it was masterful theater. And then Deng Xiaoping disappeared, and a short while later he, the stagecoach in the Wells Fargo ad? The stagecoach came galloping out around there with Deng in it, waving his 10-gallon hat out the window. So if you want symbolism, if you want an expression of an internal sentiment of a leader, here it was in its most quintessential form. So when I see Xi Jinping, and we'll get to him, well, okay, it's only to say there's not a whiff of that kind of bonhomie, that signaling that it's okay. We like each other.
So talking about liking each other, what was the chemistry between Carter from Georgia and Deng Xiaoping?
Very receptive. I mean, Carter was very restrained, but remember, he was also the human rights president. But they really hugged it out in Washington, and then I think Carter didn't come to Texas. I can't remember. I think he came to Atlanta. But there also was a tremendous amount of friendliness evinced between them. And, it was a moment when you knew we were at a historical inflection point.
So, many years later, actually in 2023, because I broke the news in a former podcast I did, it turns out that Deng Xiaoping spent his last night in Washington at the CIA. He went out to Langley, and he met with Stansfield Turner and Frank Carlucci, and he wanted to check out the arrangement that had been agreed to, basically, but he wanted to put the final word on it about the joint spy stations out in Xinjiang.
Kissinger and Nixon set
Right.
up.
Well, no, they were set up after that.
Yeah, after that, but as a result of that.
It was an outcome of that. And he went out to Langley, and they talked about these spy stations.
Against Russia.
Against Russia, exactly, to spy on the Soviet Union's testing of its nuclear weapons. That's basically what the spy stations were for. So Deng must have been, to go to CIA headquarters, first and last time a Chinese leader has been there, he must have been very anti-Soviet. Did you get a sense of that when he was around?
Yes. I mean, I think that there continued at that point to be some real resistance against the Soviet Union. I think not as intense as when Nixon and Kissinger went. But I think also it was a gesture on the American side. I mean, we didn't know what engagement was. We didn't have the word engagement. But engagement made a giant leap forward through such gestures as I've described and the trip to the CIA. It basically said that we need to sort of let each other into our inner sanctums of each other's governments and get along a little better.
Why do you think Deng was so anti-Soviet? He had visited Russia as the Soviet Union as a young man. What was it that drove it, do you think?
Well, I mean, there were a lot of border disputes. I think Russia got very upset by Chairman Mao, who had said that, in effect, he detected the first green shoots of socialism arising in China, whereas Russia had been at it much longer, and there was no sign of socialism on the horizon. And they didn't like Khrushchev. I mean, there were all kinds of complicated ideological issues, as well as a 4,000-mile border between them, and a lot of territory that had been handed off to Russia during the Tsar and the Qing dynasty that was in contention. And so it took the United States a long time to kind of actually accept that there wasn't a unified sort of communist bloc, that there was these fault lines within it. And that was what Kissinger detected.
Right. So let's fast forward again. Deng's still in power, and you're spending 2 months on Tiananmen Square during the protests for democracy. Mm-hmm. What was the message at the time, and what do you think drove Deng to really crack down like that?
Well, Jane, before we get there, we should at least do a passing comment on the extraordinary decade of the 1980s, which led up to 1989 and the massacre, because that was when Hu Yaobang and then Jiang Zemin were in power, and it was one of the most, I think, extraordinary periods of history that I've had the privilege to actually live through and watch.
How long were you there in the 80s?
Oh, all the time.
All the time.
I mean, my wife was Chinese. We had an apartment in China. We were back and forth, and it was precipitated largely by Deng Xiaoping and Hu Yaobang, who was actually a colleague of Deng Xiaoping and had undergone similar persecutions during the Cultural Revolution and been re-elevated. And it was Hu Yaobang that actually proposed, and Deng effected, a rescinding of all of the charges of being counter-revolutionary, bourgeois elements, capitalist roaders, all of the things that had put people in labor camps and defrocked them during the Cultural Revolution. That was a monumental moment. And to be back in China in the 1980s, every day something happened that just surprised the daylights out of you. I mean, a new publication came out, students would have salons on campuses. Someone would say something, there'd be a new exchange program. It was one of the most shockingly different periods when China was, as one British diplomat wrote as the title of his book, coming alive. And again, it was a very important period, I think, for those of us who were there, because it set a milestone for what could happen and did happen. As compared to what's going on now. But sadly, as you know, and you just mentioned it, it ended in the demonstrations in Tiananmen Square, which were 7 weeks after the death of Hu Yaobang, who was considered the soul of China. And that put an end to some of the more important aspects of reform. And it was an incredibly tragic moment.
And it made the idea of engagement made the idea of engagement not have much sense in a way.
Well, it was.
That's what you wrote later.
Yes, it was. It really just blew engagement up. But interestingly, right after the massacre, when everybody was furious at China and the tensions between China and the rest of the world were just really upsetting the whole Chinese proposition, one interesting thing happened. Bush Sr. was president. He had been in China in the mid-70s as before we had an official embassy. And he sent his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, to China. This is days after the massacre. Didn't tell the American ambassador. And I got the transcript of that. And
recently, you got the transcript of that recently.
Yeah, it's at Texas A&M in the Bush Library. What did Scowcroft do? He said to Deng Xiaoping in hours-long meetings they had, please, please, please.
He was the one who was pleading.
He was pleading. Don't break off this engagement we have. Bush is your friend. Let's try to keep some of it together. And Deng Xiaoping was furious. And he said, you caused this demonstration. You caused this crisis in China with your peaceful evolution, your ideological warfare, your pro-democracy lobbying, and your anti-China sentiment. And it's a heartbreaking document to read because you realize that America really did take seriously an effort to somehow overcome the challenges of getting along with China. But at that moment, Deng Xiaoping was so furious at what had happened. He had to kill his own people.
And Scowcroft went twice. Did we know?
I think he went back again, and that's the time he got caught with a glass of champagne toasting, I forget who, and that wasn't great.
And then an outgrowth of the crackdown was the situation with Fang Lizhe, the astrophysicist who you knew very well and who was hidden at the American embassy the day after the crackdown.
Yeah.
And then you got word that he was being awarded the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award. And so the Kennedy family wanted you to go and interview him for the award that was being presented here in the United States. And so you were taken into the embassy grounds.
Well, the Kennedys were worried that awarding Fang Lizhe, who was somewhere in the American embassy, but the American embassy had 3 compounds. All were surrounded by People's Liberation Army. Everyone was afraid they'd run over the walls, run inside, grab Fang Lizhe and drag him out.
But what I thought was fascinating was the ambassador at the time, James Lilly, who was a former CIA station chief, wrote in his memoirs that he brought you in, and in doing so, I was introducing Shell to some crude, clandestine procedures. What were they?
Well,
what did you do to get
I got sent to China. The Assistant Secretary of State, Richard Solomon, said, well, I don't know if you're going to get in. You know, we don't want anyone to know where Fang is. Nobody's been in to see him. And he said, but I'll tell you what, go to China, go to your room. As soon as you get there, stay by the phone. So I went to my hotel room, got in that night, and as soon as I got in, the phone rang. And it said, meet us downstairs at the front door to the lobby. I went down. There were 2 guys there, and they didn't introduce themselves. They said, get in the car, but don't talk.
Could you tell they were Americans?
They were CIA officials. They were the CIA people at the embassy. That we think all our cars are bugged. They drove me to the ambassador's residence. I went in. There was Jim Lilly. We had dinner together. Didn't talk about anything. And then it looked like dinner was over and the servants were going home. And I said, finally, Jim, listen, I'm tired. I guess good to see you. I think I'll go home. And he said like this. And then he said, and we went into the kitchen, which was all dark because the cooks had all gone. And he was waiting for the staff to go home. And we walked down the back stairs of the embassy residence. This wasn't the embassy itself. It was the ambassador's residence. And we walked across the courtyard. He knocked a code on a door. Door opened, dark room. There were a bunch of guys, shadowy guys, and banged on another door, another code. The door opened, and there was Fang Lizhe. So we spent the whole night talking.
What did he do when he saw you? Because he knew you.
I think he knew. They told him that they were going to let me in. And he said, yes, I want this award. And so I went and accepted it for him. And Lech Walesa came. This was at Georgetown, and it was a big ceremony. And ultimately, he got out. And then things began to fall a little. As I think you all know, Jiang Zemin had come to power, and then the Clinton trip happened, and we could talk about that.
So then we'll go forward to Jiang Zemin. And television seems to have played a big role in Jiang, both in presenting himself to the American public and also to his own people. So there was this news conference in the late 90s in Beijing when Clinton went to visit. And Jiang spoke a lot in English, and they even touched on, God forbid, Tibet and the Dalai Lama. It's very interesting. What did Jiang get out of that as far as his own people were concerned?
I think, the thing about Jiang Zemin at the time, and I know there are other correspondents here or historians and scholars who remember that period, we thought Jiang Zemin was a little bit clownish because he loved to do things like recite the Gettysburg Address in English or sing Solo Mio in Italian. It was a little bit, I don't know, corny. But as I reflect back on it, and I was there with Clinton and watched this extraordinary press conference, I have a totally different view. I think it was Jiang Zemin trying to be a normal leader, a normal person, to show that he did have some knowledge of an appreciation of the West, unlike Xi Jinping.
And this was broadcast live.
Well, so we were walking into the Great Hall of the People after the armor, whatever they call it, guard and the trumpets. And it was announced suddenly that Jiang Zemin had decided that the press conference, which was going to have open questions, was going to be broadcast live on radio and television over CCTV all over China. That's never had happened before.
Hasn't happened since.
And there's not a snowball's chance in hell it would happen now. So again, there's another kind of really interesting milestone of sort of dramatic signaling that Jiang Zemin sent out that was saying it's okay, you know? And he and Clinton were like a vaudeville show up there on the stage together. They were bantering back and forth. And you mentioned the discussion of Tibet and how that happened was so mind-boggling that Jiang Zemin said to Clinton, you know, he said, Mr. Clinton, I want to ask you, when I go to America, I see all these people running around who are interested in what he said, Lama Jiao, which is Tibetan Buddhism. Why is that? And then Clinton sort of went off on a tear and he said, you know, Chairman Jiang, I think if you had a chance to meet the Dalai Lama, you'd really like him. And oh my God, that was a little more than Jiang. He was sort of off script. And he kind of grabbed the podium and then he said, well, with the president's permission, perhaps we'll turn to some other subject. But it was, again, a suggestion of the openness that those two, they seemed to take pleasure in each other's company, not just sort of at each other's throats. And again, it was another moment when you could see that two human beings were, I mean, of course, ideology, of course, politics, national interests always matter, but also what matters so often is the disposition of each leader and the chemistry between two leaders.
And what's extraordinary, Jiang Zemin followed that up with doing a 60 Minutes interview with Mike Wallace. Who'd have ever thought the Chinese leader would do that?
And Deng did the same thing. And did an interview with Oriana Fallaci, the great Italian journalist. And I remember, to skip a little bit forward here, no, backward, 1989, Tom Brokaw took the entire NBC crew to China, the Today Show, every other show, and for a couple of weeks. And my wife was organizing things for him. He asked if he could interview Zhao Ziyang. So we knew his daughter, and we asked her, and she asked her father, and her father said, well, didn't he just go to Dharamsala and interview the Dalai Lama? And I said, yes, indeed he did. Well, could we see that tape? So we got the tape. Zhao Ziyang watched the tape and said, okay, I'll interview with Tom Brokaw. And they had the most extraordinary interview where Zhao Ziyang is sitting there with a bottle of beer on the table, which seems just unthinkable now. And they were just talking like two normal people, smiling and back and forth. It's really interesting to go back and look at that, and you see, again, a different kind of chemistry. So that was also was the kind of a thing that could happen given the relationships between the leaders at that time.
Well, I'm going to fast forward, if I can, quite a lot to 2011. Hu Jintao was leader, and he was dour. Obama was president. And by that time, I think it was pretty much recognized that China was, after the financial crisis of 2008, China had learned some lessons and was really gunning to be number one. Mm-hmm. Do you think that Washington understood that? Did Obama understand that? Or I sometimes wondered, was Obama just not really that interested in China?
I think we were a bit intoxicated by the idea of engagement. And remember how engagement became engagement. It wasn't engagement until Bill Clinton because we had the Soviet Union to gang up against. But when we lost the Soviet Union as the common enemy, what was engagement worth? Well, Clinton dreamed up a new reason to have engagement, and that was this. More trade will equal more openness. So if you trade, China will slowly evolve towards a more open and soluble society, become more democratic was the unspoken word. So, you know, that was what was going on when Clinton was president. We no longer had the common enemy, but the common supposition wasn't a common one, because we thought our interactions via trade would make China more democratic.
What?
China viewed that as what they called peaceful evolution, which was an anathema because it was a secret, underhanded way to overthrow the party without ever having to fight a war.
So Hu Jintao comes along.
So this is where Hu Jintao starts saying, we're getting a little more powerful. The U.S. has had an economic crisis. We'd like the South China Sea, thank you. All ours, get off our ranch. And you get this notion for the first time of what they called Hexin Liyi, or core interest, which are not negotiable. You know, Tibet, Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea. So that really sent a very different message, was that these are our things, whether you like it or not, and you better get used to it. We're not talking about it. And this meant that we began to have some real hostile elements to the relationship, which we didn't know how to resolve. And since China didn't seem to be still reforming, we in America couldn't imagine they were slowly converging. We began to diverge.
But there was a moment which was not publicized at the time when it became quite clear what you were saying, which was when Biden was vice president and Xi Jinping was vice president.
Right.
And as you recall, they had a getting to know you trip. And Biden went to China and Xi Jinping took him to Chengdu.
Right.
And they played a little bit of pretend basketball. And after that, they went on a walk in the woods, so to say. And afterwards, a couple of years later, Biden told some of us at the press bar at the St. Regis Hotel what Xi Jinping had told him on that walk, which was this, that the United States, needs to stop sending these surveillance planes over near our coastline, because if you keep doing this, we're going to force them down. And Biden said, no, you're not going to do that because you did a very lousy job of it back in 2001. But that was a big signal, it seemed to many of us, that Xi Jinping really was going to mean business.
Yes, and I mean, there were hints of it during the Hu Jintao period. But, Xi Jinping is a very interesting man, and I think we do need to understand a lot more about who he actually is as a person, as well as his policies, because that's going to play a very important role. But, you know, it's interesting. I went to China with Jimmy Carter I think it was 2015, to just give you a suggestion of how things were beginning to change. The whole atmosphere wasn't Texas. It wasn't Clinton and Jiang Zemin. So Carter went. This was his last trip to China, and I think he knew it would be. He got there, and they really treated him badly. They wouldn't let people. He had a big little conference in the Great Hall of the People, and some of the folks he invited, like myself, weren't allowed to speak.
And Xi Jinping was in the Great Hall of the People.
Well, let me tell you that story, because it's such a horrifying story. There was a farewell dinner for Carter, and the only guy who showed up for it was Li Yuanchao, who was a lowly vice president.
A symbol, that's all.
A symbol. What is more, a man who used to be, his name Yuanchao, means support North Korea, and he changed the character. So, but anyway, he was there. So it was, and it was half full. It was a real insult to Carter. They didn't let Carter meet anybody. And this was at a moment when, if they wanted to send a signal to America that things are opening up and let's be more friendly, Carter was the guy to take the message home. So I left the banquet. I was just sort of so discouraged and depressed by it. And I walked down the hallway, and I stumbled upon another banquet hall. And peeked my head inside it, and you know who was in there? Xi Jinping. And you know who else? Zimbabwe president. What's his name?
Mugabe.
Mugabe, who is a real thug. And next day, I got the speech about eternal friendship between the freedom-loving peoples of Zimbabwe and the People's Republic. And there was Xi Jinping stiffing Carter. That to me said a lot.
But, don't you think Washington was very slow to catch on to the fact that China wasn't interested anymore in engagement? I mean, you and I were both at a lunch on February 14th, 2012.
Yes, in the State Department.
In the State Department. Benjamin Franklin room, 200 people, the whole who's who of China and the United States. The Kissinger, Zellick, Kevin Rudd, Orville Schell, many, many, many people. And who was on the stage? Xi Jinping and Vice President Biden. And I was there because I was going out to be correspondent. And I've never seen so many smiles in my entire life. The room was just wreathed with smiles. And it wasn't because it was Valentine's Day. It was because everybody thought that this relationship was just going to be hunky-dory, just fantastic. But by this stage, there were already many, many signals that it wasn't going to be so hunky-dory. Why were the Americans so slow to catch on?
Well, I think we were somewhat naive and hopeful. I mean, after all, engagement if it had worked, would have been one of the great diplomatic accomplishments of diplomatic history. That one country, America, sort of slowly cultivates another, and slowly it evolves into something that's a little less difficult to deal with. The thing that I noticed about that dinner, that luncheon in the State Department, was that, if there is ever a man on earth who could hug something out with another leader, it's Joe Biden. Backslapping, glad-handing, smiling, avuncular kind of guy. But Xi Jinping wasn't having any of it. He was standing there like a prow on a ship. And I went to L.A. I don't know if you went afterwards with them. Again, and just watching him, he wasn't buying into the, hey.
Yeah, but the Americans dressed it up with, a Lakers game and signing a document.
Jerry Brown with
and a Hollywood agreement, 34 films allowed into China, blah, blah, blah.
It wasn't magic. I mean, I think there was no leadership chemistry.
Well, let's talking about leadership chemistry. Let's fast forward again to Sunnylands, 18 months later, which was supposed to be, Obama and Xi Jinping getting to know each other, shirt sleeve summit, martinis were served. The waiter went up to Xi Jinping and said, "What would you like for a cocktail? I'll have whatever whatever Obama's having." And a huge martini glass landed in his hand, and he apparently didn't know quite what to do with it, which probably summarized the whole deal. Do you think that was a turning point? Do you think after that the Americans finally learned that
It was slow. It was slow. I mean, that was the point where they were still hopeful about there might be a G2. You remember that?
I do. And it was many more words than G2, though.
Yeah.
Some impossible acronym, some impossible many words.
That, China has ascended, but China wasn't sort of going for that. But, I think there was a huge opportunity. Well, there have been many opportunities lost, I have to say. And now we have the moment we have now with the president we have. But, I mean, even Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, she tried so hard to find some common face. And I remember I was occasionally would help her write something or do something. And I got one amazing phone call one day from her. I was driving up to see my youngest son at school, and the phone rang. It was her. And she said, "What the hell did the Chinese want?" She said, "I'm trying and trying and trying to find a way to be nice and talk to them about their kids and this, that, and the other, but I can't get any traction.
What did you tell her?
Oh my God! I mean, I could go on for a day on that. I think the fundamental problem with from Hu Jintao on down was that the leadership began to see the relationship between the U.S. and China as fundamentally embedded with a hostile proposition. That we're different than you are, you don't respect us, you don't esteem us, you want us to get rid of our system of governance, and we're not going to go there. So once you have this notion that there's a fundamental contradiction in the interaction, doesn't matter how friendly, doesn't matter how much trade you have, how many ballets go back and forth, there's a fundamental sense that interaction isn't helpful. In the Chinese perspective, it's leading to undermining the system. And this is why they closed down all the civil society. This is why we don't have that much cultural exchange or public diplomacy, because I think there's a fundamental supposition that this idea, the idea of peaceful evolution came from John Foster Dulles in the 50s. He said, well, okay, Cold War, let's not have a hot war, but we can overthrow regimes in the Soviet bloc through peaceful means. And Mao commented on this, and ever since then, it's been a notion that's been considered very toxic by the Chinese Communist Party.
And I guess this was demonstrated in spades in what you call the deep freeze trip when Obama went to Beijing in 2014. Why was it the deep freeze trip?
Obama, I think...
I still want to ask you again, do you think he was really that interested in China?
Maybe not, but never mind. It's an important country. I think he did go there, and he did his best. But they treated him unlike any of the previous presidential trips that we've discussed, where there was a certain amount of bonhomie and welcome in a sense. I mean, you remember what happened. They didn't allow him to speak at a university. And then there was that horrible incident in Hangzhou.
Oh, that was a year after.
That was a year after. But it was...
The horrible incident was that his plane landed and there was a misunderstanding or maybe purposeful mix-up with the stairs, so there weren't any proper stairs to go up to Air Force One, and Obama had to come out of the belly of the plane on the baby stairs.
Yeah. I mean, there was sort of no red carpet. It was a bit gross. Yeah, I mean, it was a bit gross, and he did it, and Obama probably could have sustained it, but it was not logical. I mean, there was a message being transmitted in that sort of indiscretion. So I think... But then, Obama did begin to get the idea of a pivot to Asia, began to get talked about.
Talked about, but never done.
Well, I have to say, I think Obama was a little slow to appreciate, but so were a lot of people. It wasn't evident exactly what was happening, but the worm was turning.
But it became pretty clear after the 2015 trip when Xi Jinping came to Washington and he stood on the lawn of the White House and said, I'm not going to militarize the islands in the South China Sea, and he went home and did just that. I mean, how much clearer can you get?
That was Biden. Oh, no, that was Obama. Excuse me.
Obama.
Yeah, it was Obama. Yeah, well, I mean, that was a pretty clear signal, wasn't it?
Definitely.
Yeah, but it took a while for us to understand that resolution that he would not militarize the South China Sea was not.
And by the way, by that stage, the Chinese had hacked into the Office of Personnel Management and stolen the records of 4 million government workers. So,
Jane, you finally have to ask yourself, as this evolves into this more hostile relationship, where even the most friendly, well-intentioned leader on the American side can't alter it. Why did it happen? And was this conscious? Was it bad diplomacy? Or were the Chinese, had they just decided, I don't think we're going to work this out with the United States. We're going to have to struggle it out.
Which is probably what happened when Trump went in 2017. And I think you noted very well that Trump would agree with Mao that before you can have construction, you have to have destruction. And so Trump goes to Beijing, and Xi Jinping puts on this dance of, shows him around all the golden statues in the Forbidden City, and then they have this evening of this formal dinner, and Arabella, Trump's granddaughter, sings by video and Chinese songs, da-da-da-da-da. But it doesn't seem to have moved Xi Jinping one
I was
iota.
on that trip, and I got to tell you, there was no chemistry. I mean, if we want to talk chemistry, forget policy. Trump is a totally different proposition himself. But had Xi Jinping wanted to work something out, sort of capo a capo with Trump, that would have been the moment to do it. But there was not a flicker of sort of we want to get something going here. We want to work this out. This is important. It was very ritualistic, very formalistic, and Xi Jinping was out to impress Trump, which he did, and with all the pomp and circumstances. But it was very scripted. There wasn't no press conference like with Jiang Zemin. Nothing like that happened. So you could see pretty much that there were no big breakthroughs.
And then we come to Biden when he's president.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, it seems to me that Biden was very defensive the whole 4 years, except on the economics when he went on the offensive and banned the export of high-end chips on October 7th, 2022, I believe. Do you think anything more could have been done by Biden to try and bring the Chinese around?
I mean, this raises the really important question, which I think it's very hard to answer. Do the Chinese want to be brought around now by the United States? Or do they think their moment has come where they don't need any longer to supplicate, they don't need to release a dissident to get the president to come, they don't need to make any concessions? Xi Jinping is not a big accommodator. He doesn't make concessions. It's sort of his way or the highway. So that's sort of where we are, and I think it grows out of a sense that China feels it's entitled. It's wealthier, it's more powerful, and it need not sort of accommodate the United States to exist. I understand that, but the trouble is, behind that standoff, there are these two very different political systems, and if they're both competing for preeminence and influence in the world, and there's whose system do you want to live under? That's the dilemma the world now confronts, is it looks who is going to fill the leadership vacuum in global geopolitics.
So what do you see ahead, Orville? Do you see war over Taiwan, a rapid decoupling of the economies? What do you see?
Well, listen, it's very hard to prognosticate. I have to say, having spent my whole life trying to figure out how to get these two countries closer together, I feel pretty gloomy right now. I don't see an awful lot of ways in which the two countries are interacting in a way that could lead anywhere that's less hostile.
I mean, we've had only one congressional delegation, I think, in 5 years. About 1,000 American students studying in China. Economic relations are in turmoil, to say the very least.
Yeah.
The Chinese have a bigger navy than the United States. They have missiles that the United States lacks. Is war on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's very difficult to foresee anything in the future, but I will note that we have a laboratory experiment going on in the Ukraine, which is rather alarming if you look at the claims of China for Taiwan and the South China Sea. Are we ready to deter? Is there anything short of deterrence? I think, for me, the lesson is 9, almost 10 presidential administrations supported engagement. It was a good arrangement. It worked for decades. And we went through some very friendly periods. And there is a deep and abiding sense, I think, of friendship amongst many Chinese people for America and for Europe. And there is a whole historical tradition of how to get along, but it's not the sort of guiding principle now.
Well, I wanted to close by saying you have a very close personal relationship with China. You speak the language. Your wife was Chinese. You have children who are Chinese and American. Do you think you will be able to go back at any point?
You know, I just read this wonderful essay in our China Books Review, which Alec Ash, who's here, edits, by Perry Link, about when he was banned from going to China, how he reconciled himself with that. It's very heartfelt and I think a brilliant piece of work. You should read it. More and more people are finding, whether they're Chinese or Americans, such as myself, that we may not ever go back to this country that we spent our whole lives with. Or in the case of Chinese, whose parents are there, whose friends are there, and life is there, because the oil and water has separated. I think if I was younger, I would be very disturbed and feel completely torn by the two imperatives of my homeland, my family, whatever adopted country you might have. Myself, at my age, as an American, I hate to say this, and it's sort of a sad thing to have to say, well, okay, if I can't go back, life doesn't always give you what you want, and it's okay. I'd rather live in my own ability to be a writer and say things I think and believe and not be frightened that there will be consequences that will destroy my career, destroy my family. I mean, my wife's parents live in Beijing. I'll never see them again, and I've accepted that. And that's the way it is for now. But I don't want to end on such a gloomy note because, you know, I've lived through this for so many decades, and I've seen, I mean, China's such an extraordinary country. And despite all the savagery of Mao's revolution and all the insanity, so many amazing people there. And my experience is there's a giant aquifer beneath the surface of a totally different world. I mean, I see a lot of you who I know out here who've lived it. You know it's there, and it will reappear. How, when, I don't know, but it's not there. So I think we have to just let history work itself out here, and if we're cut off, if you're a Chinese person and you can't go home, or if you're like me and you can't go back to the place you spent your whole life on, life doesn't always give you what you want. That's the way it is. And I'd rather say, okay, and not fret it out, because I remember what it was like trying to get visas and worrying every single time. You too, Jane. You say the wrong thing, you write the wrong thing, they drop the door on you.
Definitely.
And it is tremendously confining and constraining. And if you believe in open societies, which I do, I don't want to live there. I don't want to be under those constraints. Sorry. That's my choice. May not be everyone's.
Well, thank you, Orville, for sharing your deep felt feelings. It's very important, I think, that we all understand.
Well, it's hard to have any deep wisdom, but I do think this relationship's gone up and down, and we're at a very, very fraught moment now. All the more so because on our own side of the ledger, if anything, I would say China is the more steady state and than the United States. So we're now in a place where both sides are out of whack. It's not a very good place to weave a new comprehensive policy that makes sense for anybody.
And China just said yesterday they'll fight to the end.
Basically what Trump says. And I think in many ways, if I may just make one final brief remark, you know, I've written a little bit about this. I think Trump is very much like Mao. You know, remember what Mao says. You know, Da Niao Ten Kong, great disorder under heaven. That's what he wanted to do. He loved the Monkey King from the Journey to the West, Sun Wukong. Why? Because Sun Wukong made great disorder under heaven. He overturned everything. And Mao loved to do that. He liked nothing more than just bring in the wrecking ball. The bourgeoisie, the landlords, old tradition, old culture, Buddhist monasteries, all get rid of them. And Trump is like that.
Except for the billionaire class. He doesn't want to destroy them.
Well, he may end up destroying them despite himself, and that's sort of the tragedy of people like that they, but I think we're in an age where destruction is sort of the hallmark of all too many governments and all too many leaders. And some of the leaders we've talked about, they were trying to build, not destroy. And now we have both sides in the chaos mode, in the bring it down.
Chaos mode, but also entrenched in the chaos mode.
Yeah, and I don't know, we wouldn't be the first country to vote authoritarianism into office. Read a few books on the 30s in Germany. I mean, you feel like we're living it again in this country. So what does that mean for China? I don't know. I don't know what the heck Xi Jinping thinks is happening here. I'm sure it's very unsettling to him.
He should come and have a look.
I don't think he needs to have a look. He can just smell it, I mean, the whole world sees it. But what he's going to do about it, I don't know, but I expect he'll try to take advantage of it.
Well, maybe we should take some questions. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Orville for sharing his deep thoughts. A round of applause for Orville, please.
Well, thank you, Jane. Deep thoughts are their questions, more than deep thoughts, I would say.
Someone has the mic over here.
Sure. Hi. Orville, thank you very much for being so open and sharing so much. My name is David Zweig. I went to China first in 1974 as a Canadian, and have been sort of not had the insight that Orville has had in terms of journalism. But in society, I've had those contacts. But I wanted to pick, you're giving very much an elite perspective. So I think we've got to think about that, right? I mean, this has been set up as the leadership and the leadership views. If you look at Yashang's book, some of us were cynical back in the late 90s. To what extent is the system, and one can be the communist system, which I would say the bureaucrats never wanted to give up power, right? That there's an entrenched group of bureaucrats and center. We've had left and we have the right, and the left seems to have won. If you go back to Made in China 2025, that in many ways reflects a society force rather than it just being Xi's view that flips this. Hu Jintao, similar, started it. But just to sort of flip this around a bit and ask you to think about sort of, China as China, right? That the Yashang sort of thinks about.
Yeah, I mean, good question, David. I think that, the reason why leadership is so important in China is that there is millennial experience that leadership, we fancy that the people speak through our leaders. That's not always true, but I think that there's such a strong tradition of leadership giving signals and permission for things to happen in China that goes back a long, long way. And that's why I think leadership is so important. And we can see, we've talked about that to let people express themselves in China. It's astounding what comes out. I mean, the brilliance of it, the sort of multitude of things. When they don't want people to express themselves, you get this sort of suffocated environment which we're living in now. So that's why I would say, yes, you do need to know where society is and what its potentials are and what's happening. But we know, and we see it even in this country, when leaders says don't go there, corporations don't go there, the Law firms don't go there. Even the university presidents don't go there sometimes. And so leadership, is, even in a democracy, particularly if it has punitive retaliatory powers that it's willing to use, can suffocate society very quickly, at least for the short run.
Yes.
Good evening.
Oh, no, wait a minute. We're going here to the back. We're going to the back.
You'll be next.
Oh, thank you. My name is Alliance. I was a previous Sortman scholar, and then I worked at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But I'm from Norway now, working for the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. But I wanted to ask you, we're talking about camaraderie. You were talking.
China's going to make the most of it. They're going to make the AIIB even bigger and better than it is. They're going to do bigger and better at the UN. I think they're going to exploit the American retreat as far as they can.
I mean, I think that is logical, and I think Xi Jinping to date has been quite sane. He's hasn't moved too aggressively. He's threatened more. He actually put 30%, 4% tariffs out, but he's been holding his fire for now. That's probably very smart. But I think you're right. There's a huge leadership vacuum. And this is precisely what China would like to see, because starting first with Asia, but then perhaps even on a wider basis, I think he'd like to see China have its day in the sun and if not just be the hegemon or leader in Asia, perhaps of the world. Will that come to pass? I don't know. I think the only other alternative now, and it's not that likely, frankly, is that Europe and Canada and Japan and Korea and Australia get some kind of a understanding that doesn't depend on the United States, which wouldn't be a bad thing, because all of these countries have always responded to the United States. But now I think they're beginning to realize maybe they have to do something themselves. Whether they will, whether they can, I don't know. But I think we're at a moment that's similar to what happens after a big war. Finally, I would only say that I don't know what the resolution or solution is, but perhaps the best thing that could happen is a depression or a recession. Yes, because then both governments in the United States and in China and in Russia would then be in question. Now, it could be very chaotic, but the other alternative I like a whole lot less, which is war. And it seems to me, if you're looking for big change, it often takes a war to cause that, or something. That's where Mao and Trump have a certain sort of wisdom. If you want something new, you have to get rid of what's old.
We'll come to the back of the room soon.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much for your conversation, and I thank all the questioners. Now, of course, I'm a Chinese person from a Chinese heritage, but of course, I've never been to China except for one trip, and I understand the tribulations of trying to get a visa. However, having said that, it appears to me that the West and the East will never meet unless they actually try to understand where they're coming from. Just as you said, Vice President Biden was, hey, hi, good, blah, blah, blah. But the Chinese is like, don't touch me. What's the matter with you? It's completely different culture.
Jiang Zemin wasn't that way.
Okay, fine. Having said that, yes, he did sing, and he tried to explain to you, yes, I understand where you're coming from. I can be as adaptive. But however, let's bring it now, this moment, which I, as an investment manager, living for the last 35 years in America, an American citizen now, I said, holy macaroni, what is happening to these presidents? And I thought, this is ridiculous. So, therefore, help me understand, with your insights, to Xi Jinping, And perhaps to Trump, nobody can understand him. I'm putting you in a spot. But can you think of a way where we can resolve this peacefully without a war, let alone an imminent recession?
Over to you, Orville.
So listen, I've just spent the last umpteenth decades of my life trying to answer that question. And I married a Chinese woman. I had a wonderful marriage, so I know China. I mean, you mentioned Xi Jinping says, "Don't touch me," but that's not all Chinese.
Exactly.
So we're stuck with a guy who says, "Don't touch me." Okay. Nothing new under heaven there. But I think that I don't know what the answer is now, except I do think that looking back on the American experience, and I've been very critical of my own government in my lifetime, I think they did a pretty damn good job with engagement, starting with Nixon and Kissinger. And it evolved. And we stayed out of war. There were periods when we thought we were going to work it out together, even after 1989. But now we haven't. And I do think, finally, there is something very fundamental about a Marxist-Leninist system, that when the system finds reform, reaches the point where it may reform it out of power, then you get a very strong reaction. So that's a problem. Now, Russia reformed itself out of power, and Xi Jinping said, that's the big message. We're not going there, and nobody had the manhood to stop the Soviet Union from collapsing, and that's not going to happen to China. So, I don't know.
Hi, thanks so much, Orville. My name is Wei Shen. I'm also a Schwarzman scholar. When it comes to engagement, I would like to reckon Professor Zweig's idea on elitism. I think when it comes to engagement on a much more civilian level or a student level, a person like me, I would say on a relative scale, America has made it much, much harder for Chinese students to obtain visas. Or all these years, regardless of, I think for all these years, China is afraid of peaceful evolution. But right now, it's just a little bit bizarre that the insecurity is coming from the American side. As a Chinese, at least my university or the China Scholarship, they will never question you saying, studying America, why were you there? Are you accidentally exposed to capitalist ideas? They don't ask questions like this. They will say, go, learn, and hopefully you could come back. You can't say the same for the American government side. They would like to go to China. People in my scholarship program can attest that we have American scholars being questioned by FBI upon their return. And most Chinese young people I know, as also a very cliche experience, most comfortable to own an iPhone or a Tesla. But I think many American friends of mine would freak out if they were handed over a Huawei or they were driving a BYD. For this unfounded fear is very bizarre among American Chinese scholars in their own universities. So I'm also generally curious where paranoia coming from and why are Americans being secure side right now in these bilateral relationships?
Well, I will agree with you. It's very bizarre. But there is a long tradition in America of paranoia, and there's an even deeper tradition in China of the same. And I would say that what your experience, which it sort of breaks my heart to acknowledge it, that America was an open country, did welcome immigrants and profited immensely from them, that it's changed. And one of the reasons it's changed, but just one of the reasons, is that I think that when you begin to recognize another country, not as a country that you're making progress in terms of coming to terms with and getting closer to through the reform process or whatever else you want to say, then if you're pulling apart, you get to the point where you decide, are they an enemy, a competitor? And I think we're on the precipice of more and more Americans seeing China as a real threat. And that's why you're having trouble. Now, yes, Americans can overreact, and Americans have a deep paranoid tradition in their own, and that's come to the fore, and it's enthroned in the White House.
We can do a couple more questions because I'm getting signals to shut it down, but there are some interesting people at the back, so can we take these questions in the back, please?
Hi, yeah, my name is Ransom Miller. I'm a research associate with the Institute for Global Affairs. I'm very curious about this point about chemistry, and especially, again, this Mugabe story you referred to. I wonder, in the sort of modern landscape, it seems like there is quite a bunch of leaders with whom she does not seem to have chemistry. And I'm curious, are there other sort of contemporaries today that you would say she has like a good relationship with? I know there's been sort of a lot made of the relationship with Putin and a lot of press on that front. Is that authentic? Is that genuine? Or is that, again, part of this broader political theater?
Interesting point you raise. I do think whether she has real chemistry with Putin or not, I think the one thing they share is grievance. Both feel disrespected, disesteemed, looked down upon as, the avatars of autocracies and tin pot dictatorships and whatnot. And I think it really, and dispossessed of empire. So I think that isn't so much that they really like each other as friends, like each other openly, but that they share a common resentment to the outside world. And I should say that I think a lot of this comes from the whole Leninist narrative, which isn't entirely untrue, by the way. You imperialized us, you colonialized us, you occupied us, you exploited us. We're never going to really get together. And don't forget, Chiang Kai-shek really had a lot of this going too back in the 1930s. He starts many of the entries in his diary. Wu Wang Guochi, never forget the 100 years of humiliation. So this is deep in China's bloodstream. But America too, despite its wealth, power, and stature, also has a tradition of American paranoia. Read Richard Hofstadter.
I think I see Peter Bernstein in the back wanting to ask a question.
I wanted to ask you, Orville, about...
That microphone.
Hi, Orville. Hi, Jane. You had said about there's a spirit in China that's going to well up in the future. I wanted to ask your opinion. Why should how is America China this?
If you had more good.
This period, where the card movement, the COVID lockdown, was just a faint little glimpse, a glimmer of what lies beneath the surface of people who actually have had to live in China, particularly amongst educated people, professional people, maybe less so in rural China. But I think the other place you stay in touch is there are more and more people coming out of China.
Go to Singapore.
If you sit down and talk to them, either alone or in groups where people feel safe, oh my God, when that train gets rolling, you hear some astounding things. So I think it isn't as the Chinese are just easy to hector and bully and shut up and suppress. But, people have to be realistic too. If they're going to be living in China and can't get out and don't have money, they're going to be silent. There's nothing new under heaven here. This happens in country after country after country after country when authoritarian governments move in. Even the Germans. Nobody stood up. Nobody stood up against Stalin.
Well, can I take this young person here, please? And then I'm going to be fired. I'll never be invited back here again.
Thank you so much for sharing, and I'm Duncan.
So make it quick.
Yeah, I just one question real quick about the personality of the leaders. You mentioned several times about chemistry or personality, and I'm wondering how much do you think is Xi Jinping's personality shaping the geopolitical tensions between U.S. and China? Because he does have a pretty special upbringing as a princeling. Also, he does suffer during the Cultural Revolution, but we are now seeing going back to the Maoist era. So I was wondering, how much do you think is his personality shaping this conflict, or how much is really ideological differences between the U.S. and China?
So scholars hate to wallow into the bog of psychohistory, psychobabble, of gratuitous psychoanalysis of people they don't know. Fair enough. But that's why we have literature. So if you want to understand what's going on in China, read Stephen Greenblatt's Tyrants, about 6 plays Shakespeare wrote about tyranny. There you get chapter and verse. Read Sophocles, read Euripides, all there. Thousands of years ago, they nailed it. So I would say, apropos of Xi, there's a wonderful book about to come out. It's very dense, by a guy called Joseph Torigian.
Oh my God.
Who is writing a book on Xi Jinping's father. Now he says he doesn't want to wallow into the bog of psychobabble, but we all know that human beings have formative years and that their parents are pretty powerful formative agents. So just go get that book when it comes out. It's coming out soon. I'm reviewing it actually. And I think you'll understand better why Xi Jinping is who he is. And I'll just say this last thought. He grew up during the Cultural Revolution when his father was a 历史反革命分子, a historical counter-revolutionary, the worst of the worst. You have to imagine a 14-year-old kid sent off to the countryside, and everybody knows who your father is, and you're trying to be accepted by your peers, and your father's a counter-revolutionary. What do? I think you become more red than anybody else to prove that you aren't like your father. Even though you may love your father, you may miss your father, you don't want to be left out on his account. So I think there's a lot of formative experience that we can learn from this new book, even though he may not analyze it chapter and verse. But listen, go read some fiction.
Well, on that note, thank you very much. And I'm going to make one shameless plug. If you want to hear more interesting conversations about China-US relations, tune in to our podcast, Face Off, US versus China, and you'll hear lots and lots of stuff, and we hope that you enjoy it. Thanks for coming.
And this will be a podcast.
And this will be a podcast.